Olivia wouldn't last 6 months without me. The sentence floated through the warm glow of the restaurant like a careless joke, and for a moment, people around the long polished table laughed as if it were harmless. Crystal glasses chimed softly, a waiter passed with a tray of sparkling water, and the city lights of downtown Chicago shimmered through the tall windows 30 floors above the street. It was supposed to be a celebration dinner for Daniel Bennett's promotion, the kind of night filled with expensive wine, confident laughter, and quiet envy from colleagues who wished they had climbed the ladder as quickly as he had. Olivia Bennett sat beside him in a simple navy dress, her fingers loosely wrapped around a glass she had barely touched, the ice slowly melting inside it. She had helped plan the dinner, called the restaurant 2 weeks in advance, even reminded Daniel to wear the tie his boss liked. Yet in that moment, as the table erupted in amused chuckles, it felt as if she had somehow become the least important person in the room. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who believed every word he spoke would be accepted as truth. "I'm serious," he continued, shrugging casually as if explaining a simple fact. "Olivia's great at a lot of things, but surviving out there on her own? That's a different story." Someone across the table raised an eyebrow with a playful grin. "Come on, man. Give her some credit." Daniel laughed again, waving his hand as though brushing away the idea. "Hey, I love her. But we all know how the world works." The conversation rolled forward like a train that had already decided its direction. A few people exchanged polite smiles with Olivia, the kind people give when they are unsure whether something was meant as a joke or something sharper. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she lifted her glass slightly and took a small sip of water, the coolness settling in her chest as she listened to the low hum of the city beyond the windows. In that reflection of glass and light, she could see her own face faintly staring back at her, calm, composed, almost distant. The truth was that Daniel had said things like that before, though usually in private, usually wrapped in softer words. He believed he was the engine of their life together, the one steering every decision forward. Olivia, in his version of the story, was simply lucky to be along for the ride. The dinner continued. Plates arrived and disappeared. The conversation shifted to investments, vacations, and office politics. But Daniel's sentence lingered in the air long after the laughter faded. When the night finally ended and the group began to gather their coats, Olivia stood quietly near the window for a moment longer than anyone noticed. 30 floors below, headlights moved in steady streams through the dark streets of Chicago. The city looked endless from that height, like a map filled with possibilities no one person could fully see. Daniel was already shaking hands with a colleague near the door when she turned away from the glass. He never noticed the way her fingers briefly tightened around the strap of her purse, or the quiet determination settling behind her eyes. To him, the sentence had been a joke, a small remark lost in the noise of celebration. But to Olivia Bennett, it sounded like something else entirely. Sounded like a prediction. And somewhere deep inside her, a silent promise had just begun to form. The drive home that night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier than any argument could have been. Streetlights slid across the windshield of Daniel Bennett's silver sedan as it moved through late-night traffic, each passing beam briefly illuminating the calm expression on Olivia Bennett's face before fading again into darkness. Daniel spoke occasionally about work, about how his boss had hinted at even bigger opportunities ahead, about how important it was to stay focused in a competitive industry. Olivia listened, nodding once in a while, her eyes following the long rows of brick buildings and glowing apartment windows passing outside. To Daniel, the evening had already become a success story he would repeat at the office the next day. To Olivia, the sentence from the dinner table continued to echo quietly in her thoughts. "You would not last 6 months without me." When they reached their townhouse on the north side of Chicago, Daniel stepped out first and unlocked the door, still talking as he walked inside. The familiar scent of lavender cleaner and fresh linen filled the hallway, the small details of a home Olivia had spent years shaping into something warm and steady. Framed photographs lined the wall beside the stairs, snapshots of vacations, birthdays, and smiling moments that once felt permanent. Daniel tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter and loosened his tie. He glanced toward Olivia with a casual smile that suggested the evening had ended exactly as he expected. "Good night, huh?" he said, opening the refrigerator. Olivia placed her purse on the table and looked around the room in a way she had never quite done before, as if she were seeing it not as her home but as a chapter already beginning to close. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Outside, a train horn echoed faintly somewhere in the distance. "Daniel," she said softly. He looked up from pouring himself a glass of water. "Yeah." There was no anger in her voice, no raised tone, nothing that might have prepared him for the quiet shift in the air. "Do you really believe what you said tonight?" Daniel blinked once, confused for a moment, then laughed lightly as if the question surprised him. "Olivia, come on. It was a joke." People were laughing. She watched him for a few seconds, studying the ease in his posture, the certainty that the world had already arranged itself around his confidence. "But you meant it," she said. Daniel shrugged, leaning against the counter. "I mean, we both know I handle most of the big stuff. The finances, the decisions. That is not a bad thing. That is just how things turned out." Olivia nodded slowly, absorbing the words with the same calm composure she had carried all evening. Somewhere deep inside, the promise that had begun forming near the restaurant window grew clearer, steadier. Not anger, not even resentment, just clarity. She walked to the hallway and gently lifted one of the framed photographs from the wall. It showed the two of them standing on a beach in California 3 years earlier, wind pulling at her hair while Daniel grinned proudly at the camera. For a long moment she studied the picture, then carefully set it back in place. When she turned around, Daniel had already moved on to checking his phone, answering a message from someone at work. The quiet distance between them stretched across the room like an invisible line neither of them had noticed before. Olivia looked toward the front door, then back at the house once more. And in that silent moment, something inside her settled with quiet certainty, the kind of decision that does not need to be announced out loud. The following morning arrived quietly, the pale winter sunlight of Chicago slipping through the kitchen windows and settling across the wooden floor in long rectangles of soft gold. Olivia Bennett stood by the counter holding a warm mug of coffee, watching the neighborhood slowly come alive beyond the glass. A delivery truck rolled down the street, a neighbor walked his dog past the row of townhouses, and somewhere a car radio played faintly through an open window. Inside the house everything looked the same as it had the day before, yet the air carried a strange stillness, like the pause that comes before a new chapter begins. Daniel Bennett moved through the kitchen with the brisk confidence of someone who believed the day already belonged to him. He checked his phone while eating a quick breakfast, scanning emails from the office and occasionally muttering about deadlines. Olivia noticed how naturally he filled the room with his plans and expectations, as though the future had already been mapped out in his favor. "I might be late tonight," Daniel said without looking up. "Big meeting coming up and everyone is pushing to get numbers finalized." Olivia nodded quietly. She had heard versions of that sentence many times before. Daniel finally glanced at her and gave a casual smile. "You should think about picking up some freelance work again. It would keep you busy." His tone was light, almost helpful, yet the words carried the same quiet assumption that had shaped their life together for years. Olivia wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, feeling the warmth settle into her palms. She thought about the dinner from the night before, about the laughter at the table and the sentence that had floated through the room like an invisible line dividing who she had been from who she might become. Daniel finished his coffee and grabbed his coat from the chair. "Do not worry about what I said last night," he added as he walked toward the door. "You know how people are at those dinners. Everyone exaggerates a little." Olivia watched him tie his shoes near the entrance. "Maybe," she replied softly. Daniel opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air. A moment later, his car engine started, the sound fading as he drove away toward downtown Chicago, and another day of meetings and negotiations. The house grew quiet again. Olivia remained in the kitchen for several minutes, listening to the ticking clock and the distant rumble of a train crossing the city somewhere far away. Then she set the empty mug in the sink and walked upstairs with slow, deliberate steps. The bedroom closet stood half open, revealing rows of neatly arranged clothes and the suitcase tucked into the corner. Olivia pulled the suitcase out and placed it gently on the bed. For a long moment she simply looked at it, her expression calm but determined. The promise that had formed inside her the night before now felt clear and steady, like a compass pointing toward a direction she had never allowed herself to consider. She opened the suitcase and began folding a few pieces of clothing with quiet precision. Outside the window, the winter sun climbed higher above the rooftops, casting a bright reflection across the glass. Olivia Bennett paused once to glance at that light, and in her eyes there was something new, something Daniel Bennett had never taken the time to notice before. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was the quiet beginning of independence. The suitcase on the bed slowly began to fill with the quiet rhythm of deliberate choices. Olivia Bennett folded each piece of clothing carefully, placing it inside as though she were packing more than just fabric and shoes, as though each item represented a small piece of the life she was choosing to carry forward. Outside the bedroom window, the late morning sunlight stretched across the rooftops of Chicago, reflecting off the icy patches that still clung to the sidewalks from the previous night's cold. The neighborhood continued with its ordinary routines while inside the townhouse something far less ordinary was unfolding. Olivia paused for a moment and sat at the edge of the bed, her hands resting on the closed suitcase lid as she looked around the room she had shared with Daniel Bennett for years. The walls were decorated with neutral colors she had once chosen carefully, believing they would create a peaceful home for both of them. A framed certificate from Daniel's first promotion hung near the desk, and on the dresser sat a small wooden jewelry box Daniel had bought during a business trip to Seattle. For a long time Olivia had believed these objects represented stability, proof that their life together was moving in the right direction. Now they simply looked like reminders of a story that had quietly reached its final page. She stood and walked to the closet again, pulling down a coat and placing it gently into the suitcase. The sound of a delivery truck outside briefly filled the silence before fading down the street. Olivia closed the suitcase and zipped it carefully, the soft mechanical sound echoing faintly through the bedroom. Downstairs the house remained still, the kitchen clock ticking steadily in the background. She carried the suitcase down the stairs one step at a time, her movements calm and unhurried, as though she had already rehearsed this moment in her mind. In the living room she stopped beside the wall of framed photographs again. Her eyes moved slowly across the images, the beach in California, a holiday dinner with friends, a smiling picture from a charity event Daniel had once insisted they attend together. Olivia studied the photographs not with regret but with quiet understanding. Life had been comfortable here, predictable in a way that had once felt safe. Yet comfort had also become a kind of invisible boundary, one that kept her small enough to fit neatly beside Daniel's ambitions. She reached out and straightened one slightly crooked frame before stepping back. The gesture felt like closing a door without needing to slam it. A few minutes later she walked to the front entrance and placed the suitcase beside the door. The winter air outside had grown brighter, the sky above the street a clear pale blue. Olivia slipped on her coat and glanced once more across the living room. There was no dramatic farewell, no words spoken to empty rooms. Just a quiet breath and the steady awareness that her future would not be decided by anyone else's expectations. She opened the door and stepped outside onto the cold front steps, pulling the door gently closed behind her. The lock clicked softly. Down the street the sound of traffic drifted from the direction of downtown Chicago, where Daniel Bennett was likely already sitting in another meeting, confident that the life he had built would continue exactly as planned. What he did not know, what he had never taken the time to imagine, was that at that very moment Olivia Bennett was walking away from the version of herself he had always believed would stay. And with every step she took down that quiet winter street, the distance between his prediction and her reality quietly began to grow. The cold air outside carried the sharp scent of winter as Olivia Bennett rolled her suitcase down the quiet sidewalk, each small wheel clicking softly against the uneven pavement. The morning had grown brighter, sunlight reflecting off parked cars and frosted lawns, giving the street a clean, almost peaceful glow that felt strangely fitting for a beginning she had never imagined planning. She walked steadily toward the corner where a taxi waited beside the curb, the driver leaning casually against the door while sipping coffee from a paper cup. When he noticed her approaching with the suitcase, he straightened and opened the trunk with a polite nod. "Airport?" he asked in a friendly voice. Olivia paused for half a second, the question hanging in the cold air between them. For a moment she considered how easily the answer could shape the direction of her day, maybe even the direction of her life. Then she gave a small calm smile and said, "Union Station, please." The driver lifted the suitcase into the trunk and closed it gently before walking around to the front seat. Olivia settled into the back of the taxi, the warm interior fogging the windows slightly as the heater hummed to life. The car pulled away from the curb and began weaving through the quiet neighborhood streets, passing the familiar coffee shop on the corner, and the small grocery store where she and Daniel had once argued about which cereal to buy on a rainy Sunday morning. The memories drifted through her mind without bitterness, like old photographs slowly fading into the background of a much larger story. Downtown Chicago appeared gradually ahead, the tall skyline rising above the river with steel and glass towers catching the morning sun. Olivia watched the buildings grow larger as the taxi merged into heavier traffic. People hurried along sidewalks carrying briefcases and paper cups, taxis honked impatiently, and trains rumbled across elevated tracks above the streets. The city was waking into its usual rhythm, a place where thousands of lives changed direction every single day without anyone noticing. The taxi finally pulled to a stop in front of the grand entrance of Union Station, its massive stone columns standing proudly against the bright sky. The driver stepped out and opened the trunk again while Olivia climbed onto the sidewalk, the cool air brushing across her face. Inside the station, the vast hall stretched wide with marble floors and tall windows that poured sunlight across the room like a golden river. Travelers moved in every direction with rolling luggage and hurried steps, announcements echoing softly from the ceiling speakers. Olivia stood for a moment near the entrance, taking in the movement around her. For the first time since leaving the townhouse that morning, she felt the quiet weight of what she had done. She had stepped away from a life that once felt permanent, guided only by the quiet belief that she was capable of more than someone else's expectations. She walked toward the ticket counter and waited patiently in line, her suitcase standing upright beside her. When it was finally her turn, the woman behind the counter offered a polite smile. "Where are you heading today?" Olivia looked briefly toward the large departure board glowing above the hall, filled with cities and times stretching across the country like open doors. She chose one without hesitation. "New York City," she said calmly. The clerk nodded and began printing the ticket, while the distant sound of a departing train echoed through the station. As Olivia accepted the small paper ticket and turned toward the platform entrance, the promise she had made to herself the night before no longer felt like a distant idea. It felt like the first real step into a future that belonged entirely to her. The train began to move slowly out of Union Station, the heavy steel wheels rolling across the tracks with a steady rhythm that echoed through the passenger car like a quiet heartbeat. Olivia Bennett sat beside the window, her suitcase tucked neatly in the overhead compartment while the vast architecture of Chicago gradually slid past the glass. The towering office buildings faded into rows of smaller brick structures, and eventually into long stretches of industrial yards and open rail lines dusted with thin patches of winter snow. She rested her hands calmly in her lap, watching the city she had known for years slowly disappear behind her. Around her the train car filled with the soft sounds of travel, the rustling of newspapers, the low murmur of conversations, and the distant hum of the engine pulling dozens of cars across the Midwest. A conductor walked down the aisle checking tickets with practiced efficiency, offering polite nods and brief smiles to each passenger. When he reached Olivia, she handed him the small paper ticket she had purchased only an hour earlier. "New York City," he said after glancing at it, marking the corner with a small punch. "About 20 hours from here. Long ride, but it is a good one." Olivia returned the ticket with a quiet thank you and watched as he moved on to the next row. The words 20 hours lingered in her thoughts. 20 hours between the life she had left behind and the one she had not yet begun. Outside the window the landscape slowly changed from city blocks to wide fields and distant farmhouses, the pale winter sky stretching endlessly above them. Olivia leaned her head slightly against the cool glass, allowing herself the rare moment of simply breathing without the constant background pressure that had shaped her life with Daniel Bennett. For years she had measured her choices around his ambitions, his career moves, his expectations about what their future should look like. Yet now, as the train carried her farther from Chicago mile by mile, she felt something unexpected growing inside her. It was not fear. It was possibility. A few rows ahead a young mother quietly read a storybook to her small daughter, the child listening with wide eyes while the pages turned slowly. Across the aisle an older man carefully unfolded a map, tracing a finger along the route of the train as if he were rediscovering the geography of the country one line at a time. The ordinary moments of strangers traveling toward their own destinations created a strange sense of comfort for Olivia. Everyone on this train was moving toward something new. Hours passed as the afternoon sunlight softened across the snowy fields outside. At one point the train crossed a long steel bridge over a frozen river, the water below reflecting the pale sky like a sheet of silver glass. Olivia watched the reflection ripple gently as the train thundered across. Somewhere in Chicago, Daniel Bennett would eventually return home and discover the quiet absence she had left behind. Perhaps he would be confused. Perhaps he would assume she simply needed time away. What he would not understand, at least not yet, was that Olivia Bennett was not running from anything. She was stepping toward a version of herself that had waited patiently for the moment she finally chose to listen. As the train continued eastward through the fading afternoon light, the promise she had made to herself grew stronger with every passing mile, carried forward by the steady rhythm of the tracks beneath her. The train rolled into New York City just after sunrise the next morning, the pale light of dawn spreading across rows of tall buildings as the skyline slowly appeared through the window. Olivia Bennett sat quietly as the massive structure of Penn Station approached, the steel tracks weaving together beneath the train like threads guiding thousands of journeys into the heart of the city. The announcement over the speaker welcomed passengers to Manhattan, the voice calm and routine, yet to Olivia it sounded like the beginning of something entirely new. She gathered her coat and stepped down from the train with the rest of the travelers, the platform alive with motion as people hurried toward escalators, taxis, and morning meetings. The air inside the station carried the mixed scent of fresh coffee, and the faint metallic hum of trains arriving and departing every few minutes. Olivia paused for a moment near the top of the escalator, taking in the movement around her. New York moved differently than Chicago. It felt faster, louder, filled with an energy that seemed to push every person forward, whether they were ready or not. Outside the station the city streets were already alive. Yellow taxis lined the curb, buses roared past intersections, and pedestrians crossed the avenues with determined steps as if the day had already begun hours earlier. Olivia stepped onto the sidewalk with her suitcase and looked up at the rows of glass towers stretching high above the street. The morning sun reflected off the windows in bright flashes of light, turning the skyline into something almost electric. For a brief moment she felt the weight of being completely alone in a city of more than 8 million people. Yet instead of fear she felt a quiet thrill of possibility. No one here knew who she had been in Chicago. No one here expected her to live inside the boundaries someone else had drawn. She hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of a modest hotel she had found the night before while sitting on the train. The ride through Manhattan felt like watching a movie from the back seat. Skyscrapers rose beside narrow streets, delivery trucks blocked corners, and small cafes spilled the scent of fresh bread into the cold winter air. When the taxi stopped in front of the hotel, Olivia paid the driver and carried her suitcase inside. The lobby was simple but welcoming, with warm lighting and a quiet piano melody playing somewhere in the background. After checking in, she stepped into her small room and set the suitcase beside the bed. The window overlooked a busy street where people hurried along the sidewalks below, each person moving with purpose. Olivia stood there for several minutes watching the movement of the city. Somewhere across the country Daniel Bennett would soon realize she had left. Perhaps he would search for answers. Perhaps he would assume she would return. What he could not see was the quiet determination forming inside her, as she looked out at the endless possibilities of New York City. Olivia Bennett had arrived with only a suitcase, a train ticket, and the promise she had made to herself. Yet as the city roared to life outside her window, she understood something clearly for the first time. This was not the end of her story. It was only the first page of a much larger one waiting to be written. The first week in New York City passed in a blur of unfamiliar streets, cold winter wind, and the constant rhythm of a city that never seemed to slow down. Each morning Olivia Bennett woke up in the small hotel room with the quiet awareness that her life no longer belonged to the expectations she had left behind in Chicago. The room was modest, barely larger than the bedroom she had shared with Daniel Bennett, yet to her it felt strangely expansive because every decision inside it was now hers alone. On the second morning she walked out into the crisp Manhattan air before sunrise, the sidewalks already alive with delivery workers, early commuters, and the glow of coffee shops opening their doors. She bought a cup of hot coffee from a corner cafe, and stood near the window watching the city wake up one block at a time. The steam rising from the cup warmed her hands while her thoughts slowly settled into something steady and focused. Olivia had not come to New York simply to disappear into anonymity. She had come because somewhere inside her she believed she was capable of building something new, even if she did not yet know exactly what shape that future would take. Over the next few days she began exploring the city with quiet determination. She walked for miles through Midtown and the Upper West Side, studying the endless movement of people and businesses that filled every street. New York rewarded those who paid attention. Small opportunities seemed to hide everywhere between the tall buildings and crowded subway entrances. Olivia visited bookstores, business centers, and libraries, spending hours reading about entrepreneurship, finance, and the industries that fueled the city's restless energy. In Chicago, she had often placed her own ambitions quietly behind Daniel's career plans. Here no one expected her to remain in the background. One afternoon while sitting inside a public library near Bryant Park, Olivia opened her notebook and began writing ideas that had quietly lived in her mind for years. She had always been fascinated by small businesses that struggled to gain attention in crowded markets, companies with strong products but little understanding of branding or communication. She imagined helping them grow, guiding them toward the visibility they deserved. The idea was simple, but the more she wrote the more it began to feel possible. Later that evening she returned to the hotel room and spread her notes across the small desk near the window. Outside, the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the skyline like thousands of tiny stars. Olivia worked quietly for hours, refining her thoughts and outlining plans with a calm focus she had never fully allowed herself before. For the first time in years she was not measuring her progress against someone else's expectations. She was building something entirely her own. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Daniel Bennett continued moving through his life believing the world still followed the predictable structure he understood so well. Yet in a small hotel room overlooking a busy New York street, Olivia Bennett was slowly transforming the uncertainty of her new beginning into a vision that would eventually change far more than either of them could imagine. The idea that had begun as a few quiet notes inside Olivia Bennett's notebook slowly started to take shape over the following weeks, like a blueprint becoming a real structure piece by piece. Each morning she left the small hotel room earlier than the day before, stepping into the fast-moving rhythm of Manhattan with a growing sense of purpose. The winter air remained cold and sharp, but the city carried a constant energy that made even long walks feel like progress. Olivia spent her days studying the patterns of small businesses across the city. She visited family-owned bakeries in Brooklyn, independent bookstores near the Upper West Side, and small clothing shops tucked into narrow streets downtown. Again and again she noticed the same pattern. Many of these businesses offered excellent products and genuine passion, yet their storefronts remained quiet while larger competitors captured attention through better marketing and stronger brand stories. Olivia listened carefully when owners spoke about their struggles. She asked questions about their goals, their customers, and the obstacles they faced trying to compete in a crowded market. At night she returned to the hotel room with pages of notes, sketching strategies and ideas long after the city lights began to glow outside her window. One evening she met a small bakery owner named Maria, who had been running her shop for nearly 15 years. The bread was fresh, the recipes had been passed down through generations, yet only a handful of customers walked through the door each afternoon. Olivia sat at a small table near the window and gently explained how the bakery could build an online presence, how storytelling and simple branding could help people understand the heart behind the business. Maria listened carefully, her eyes lighting with cautious excitement. Within 2 weeks Olivia helped the bakery create a simple website and social media presence that shared the story of Maria's family recipes and daily baking routine. The response surprised them both. Local residents began visiting the shop after seeing the posts online, curious to taste the bread that had been quietly made in the same neighborhood for years. Watching the small bakery fill with new customers gave Olivia a feeling she had not experienced in a long time. It was not just satisfaction. It was proof that her instincts had value. Slowly the idea she had written inside her notebook evolved into something real. Olivia began offering consulting help to other small businesses across Manhattan, guiding them through the process of building stronger identities and connecting with their communities. The work was demanding and the income at first was modest, But every successful project strengthened her confidence. For the first time in years she was building something entirely her own. Months earlier Daniel Bennett had believed she would struggle to find direction without him. Yet as spring slowly replaced winter in New York City, Olivia Bennett was discovering a truth that no one else could define for her. She was not simply surviving on her own. She was quietly building a future that grew stronger with every step she took. By the time summer arrived in New York City, Olivia Bennett's small consulting idea had quietly grown into something far more solid than the pages of notes she had once spread across the desk in her hotel room. The modest hotel had long since been replaced by a small apartment in Manhattan, a bright space on the 8th floor of a narrow building where the windows overlooked a busy avenue filled with taxis, food carts, and the constant flow of people moving toward their own ambitions. Every morning Olivia walked 6 blocks to a shared workspace she had recently rented with several other entrepreneurs, a modern office filled with long wooden tables, glowing laptop screens, and the soft hum of creativity. The business she had started helping one bakery had now expanded to include restaurants, local clothing brands, and small tech startups looking for guidance on how to present themselves in a competitive market. Word traveled quickly in a city like New York. When one business began to grow, others noticed. Olivia's calm approach, her ability to listen carefully and translate a company's story into a clear message, began attracting attention from owners who had struggled for years to be noticed. One afternoon she sat across from the owner of a small handmade furniture company that had nearly closed its doors after losing customers to larger competitors. Olivia studied the photographs of their work, the craftsmanship in the wood, the careful detail in every design. "Your problem is not the quality," she explained gently. "Your problem is that no one knows the story behind it." Over the next several weeks she helped them build a digital catalog, share videos of their workshop, and connect their brand to the community that valued handcrafted work. Within months new orders began arriving from across the city, and even from neighboring states. Watching businesses grow stronger gave Olivia a quiet sense of pride that no title or promotion had ever provided before. One evening after finishing a long day of meetings, she remained in the office while the sun slowly set beyond the skyline. The golden light poured through the tall windows, reflecting off the glass towers across Manhattan, and turning the entire city into a sea of warm color. Olivia leaned back in her chair and glanced at the whiteboard beside her desk where the names of current clients filled several neat columns. Only a year earlier she had arrived in New York with a single suitcase and a promise to herself. Now she was running a consulting firm that was slowly building a reputation among small businesses looking for growth. Her phone vibrated softly on the desk with a message from a new client, asking about scheduling a consultation the following week. Olivia smiled quietly before replying that she would be happy to meet. Hundreds of miles away Daniel Bennett continued living inside the version of the story he believed had already been written. He had once been certain that Olivia would struggle to find direction without him. Yet as the lights of New York City flickered on across the skyline and the office slowly emptied for the night, Olivia Bennett understood something that made her smile even more. The life she was building was not simply proving someone wrong. It was proving to herself that the limits others had imagined for her had never truly existed. The invitation arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, delivered not by mail but by a carefully worded email that appeared among Olivia Bennett's growing list of client messages. She had just settled into her chair at the shared office workspace when the notification appeared on her laptop screen. At first it looked like another business inquiry, but as she opened it and read the details, her expression grew still with surprise. The message was from the organizers of a national small business innovation conference scheduled to take place later that month in Chicago. They had been following the recent growth stories connected to her consulting work, and wanted her to speak on a panel about helping local businesses compete in modern markets. For a moment Olivia simply stared at the screen, the city of New York humming outside the office windows while a distant memory slowly resurfaced in her mind. Chicago. The skyline by the lake. The streets she had once walked every day beside Daniel Bennett. It had been more than a year since she left that city with a single suitcase and a quiet promise to herself. She leaned back slightly in her chair and read the invitation again, this time noticing the final line asking if she would be available to attend the opening evening reception and networking gala. The conference would bring together entrepreneurs, investors, and business leaders from across the country. It was exactly the kind of event where new partnerships often began. Across the room, a few other entrepreneurs were quietly working at their desks, the familiar sound of keyboards and low conversations filling the air. Olivia closed her laptop halfway and allowed herself a moment to think. Returning to Chicago had never been part of any plan she had written down in her notebook months earlier. Yet the invitation felt less like a coincidence and more like a circle quietly completing itself. By the afternoon, she had accepted the invitation and confirmed her flight. 2 weeks later, she stepped off the plane at Chicago O'Hare International Airport with the same calm composure she had carried since the day she left. The city looked familiar and distant at the same time as the taxi carried her toward downtown along the wide expressway lined with towering buildings and busy traffic. When the skyline appeared beside Lake Michigan, Olivia felt a brief wave of memories, but they no longer carried the weight they once had. The conference hotel stood tall in the center of the city, its glass entrance reflecting the golden light of early evening. Inside the lobby, guests gathered in small groups wearing tailored suits and elegant dresses, their conversations blending into a lively background of opportunity and ambition. Olivia checked into her room and changed into a simple but elegant evening dress before heading down to the gala reception taking place in the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers filled the ceiling with warm light while a quiet jazz band played near the far wall. Waiters moved gracefully between guests offering drinks and appetizers as conversations flowed across the room. Olivia stepped inside with the quiet confidence of someone who had built her place through steady work rather than loud declarations. Across the ballroom, a familiar voice suddenly paused in mid-conversation. Daniel Bennett stood near a group of executives, a glass in his hand, his eyes fixed in disbelief at the woman who had just entered the room. For a brief moment, the noise of the gala seemed to fade as recognition settled across his face. The woman he once believed would struggle without him was now standing confidently among the very business leaders he had always hoped to impress. Daniel Bennett remained frozen for a moment near the center of the ballroom, the soft music of the jazz band continuing behind him while conversations flowed around the room. Yet his attention had narrowed completely to the woman who had just entered through the tall glass doors. Olivia Bennett walked calmly across the polished floor beneath the chandeliers, greeting a few conference guests with a polite smile as she accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. The years had not simply changed her appearance. They had changed the quiet authority in the way she moved, the steady confidence in her posture, the calm assurance that seemed to follow her through the room like an invisible presence. Daniel blinked once, almost as if confirming that what he was seeing was real. The last image he had carried of Olivia was the woman who had quietly packed a suitcase and disappeared from the life they had built together. He had assumed she would eventually return, or at least remain somewhere far from the professional circles he now navigated every day. Yet here she was, standing among executives and entrepreneurs from across the country, as if she had always belonged in the room. One of Daniel's colleagues noticed the direction of his gaze. "Do you know her?" the man asked casually while adjusting his tie. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Yes," he said slowly. "I used to." Across the ballroom, Olivia had just been approached by one of the conference organizers, a middle-aged woman with a conference badge hanging from her neck. The organizer greeted her warmly and began introducing her to several investors standing nearby. "Everyone, this is Olivia Bennett," the woman announced with an enthusiastic smile. "She is the consultant I mentioned earlier, who has been helping small businesses scale their branding strategies across New York." The group responded with immediate interest, several people shaking Olivia's hand while asking about her recent work. She spoke with calm clarity, explaining how storytelling and digital identity had helped small companies grow in competitive markets. Her voice carried steady confidence, the kind that came from experience rather than self-promotion. Daniel watched the scene unfold with growing disbelief. The laughter, the respectful attention, the way people leaned slightly closer as Olivia described her work. None of it matched the assumptions he had carried since the day she left. He found himself slowly walking closer through the crowd, drawn forward by a mixture of curiosity and something he could not quite name. When he finally reached the edge of the conversation circle, Olivia noticed him standing there. For a brief moment their eyes met beneath the warm light of the chandeliers. The past existed quietly in that single glance, years of shared history compressed into a silent recognition. Yet Olivia's expression remained calm, almost serene. There was no anger in her gaze, no need to prove anything with dramatic words. The organizer turned slightly and noticed Daniel standing nearby. "Oh, perfect," she said brightly. "Daniel, you should meet Olivia Bennett. She will be speaking on tomorrow's panel about business growth strategies." Daniel managed a polite nod, extending his hand as if greeting a professional acquaintance. Olivia accepted the handshake with the same composed courtesy she had shown everyone else. Around them the gala continued with laughter and music, yet Daniel understood something in that moment that unsettled him more than any argument ever could. The woman standing in front of him was no longer the person he once believed he had defined. Olivia Bennett had become someone entirely beyond the limits he once imagined. The music in the ballroom continued to flow softly beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, as conversations moved from one group to another across the room. Daniel Bennett slowly withdrew his hand after the brief handshake, still trying to reconcile the composed woman standing in front of him with the quiet memory he had carried for so long. Olivia Bennett offered the same calm smile she had given the others in the group before turning slightly to answer a question from one of the investors beside her. Her voice carried clearly but gently, describing how small companies often needed more than financial support to grow. They needed someone who could see the value in their story and help them share it with the world. The people around her listened with genuine interest, several nodding as she explained how thoughtful branding could transform the future of a struggling business. Daniel remained at the edge of the conversation, observing in silence. There was no bitterness in Olivia's tone, no hint that she was standing there to prove anyone wrong. Instead, she spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had already discovered exactly where she belonged. The organizer eventually guided the group toward another part of the ballroom where additional guests were gathering for introductions. As the small circle moved away, Olivia stepped aside briefly near one of the tall windows overlooking the city lights of Chicago. The skyline stretched across the dark horizon, reflecting softly in the glass just as it had years earlier on countless ordinary nights. Daniel approached slowly, stopping a few feet away before speaking. "I did not expect to see you here," he said quietly. Olivia turned to face him, her expression steady and composed. "Life can be surprising sometimes," she replied. Daniel hesitated, searching for words that once would have come easily. "I heard you are doing well," he said finally. Olivia nodded gently. "I am building something meaningful. That matters to me." The simple statement carried no pride and no resentment. It was simply the truth. For a moment they stood there together in the quiet space near the window, while the gala continued behind them. Daniel realized that the version of Olivia he had known in the past had been shaped by the limits he assumed she could never cross. Yet the woman standing before him had quietly stepped far beyond those boundaries without needing to argue, without needing to announce her strength to the world. A group of conference guests called Olivia's name from across the room, inviting her to join another discussion near the stage where tomorrow's speakers were gathering. She offered Daniel a small polite nod before turning toward them. As she walked away beneath the warm light of the chandeliers, Daniel understood something with sudden clarity. The prediction he once spoke so casually had never truly defined her future. Olivia Bennett had not spent her time trying to prove him wrong. She had simply chosen to build a life that no longer required his belief at all. And as she joined the group of entrepreneurs and innovators preparing to share their ideas with the room, the quiet strength in her presence made one truth unmistakably clear. Sometimes the most powerful response to doubt is not an argument. It is the life someone builds after walking away.